Okay. Um, Today, we're going to look at a very colorful, interesting philosopher from the Enlightenment named George Berkeley. This video is being made for the epistemology seminar in the spring of 2021. You might also see it in one of the philosophy of psychology classes. I mention that because we're going to, George Berkeley says a lot of different things. We're going to look at a particular aspect of his work, although the aspect of his work that we're going to look at certainly is one that most people find out about. The sort of approach to this that I had today is that I certainly noticed in my years trying to get a handle around philosophy that oftentimes Berkeley is sort of presented out of context, or at least if you're just new to philosophy, you hear about Berkeley in a way that's kind of out of context, and you hear about this person who says a lot of strange things. So what I would like to do really is put him in some kind of context for you, really. Talking about, again, George Berkeley. He is a complex philosopher. He is one, I think we'll see clearly today why he is considered one of the empiricists. Of course, his position as an English language philosopher, writing after Newton in the 18th century, sort of puts him in that general school anyway. But I don't think you can really categorize Berkeley. I think he's a bridge between rationalists and empiricists. I think he also anticipates Kant. We'll talk about both of those things. His main work in philosophy, he has other things, is Principles of Human Knowledge, but really I would recommend that you read the dialogues between Hylas and Philonous. There's just a whole lot of really good argumentation in there, and it's really pretty dense. So that is the text that I think one ought to look at. All right, well, let's take a look at why Berkeley says strange things. So first of all, what does he say? Again, I'm assuming that we're talking from the standpoint of someone who really is just coming to Berkeley and saying, what's this philosopher say? What he says is that to be is to be perceived. Now, there's a lot to be unpacked there that we don't have time to unpack. To be is to be perceived. That is, somehow it is perception that creates a thing. And so we could chew on that and puzzle on that and figure out what that means. But practically speaking, for our purposes, if it's true, after all, that you're saying that something exists because it's being perceived, then that's the sense in which something is mental. Of course, that calls into question the whole notion of perception, right? I mean, if perception is supposed to be perception of something else or something different from you, and it's not clear exactly how that works here. It's not really clear how that works with anyone who has representational theory of mind. So here we are doing some epistemology, and we're going to look at Berkeley in terms of skepticism and empiricism today. But notice that when he says that to be is to be perceived is to be, so he's talking about being. So this really is a metaphysical statement. Oftentimes, of course, metaphysics and epistemology are entangled and run together, so that's no problem. When we need to talk about metaphysical things, we will. But this is a theory about primary being. So just to, I mean, if we don't have any experience with thinking about metaphysics much, it's okay. Something very simple. So you encounter someone who says that they think that everything is matter. That person's a materialist or something. Or if someone said, well, I have a concept of nature, and I want to say the only stuff that exists is natural stuff, a naturalist. I think only physical things exist. That would be a physicalist, if you will. Right, so each one of those isms is a little mini theory, right? They're telling you what the theory is. A materialist, so they think that matter is primary being. Whatever that means, of course, but in any event. So we have our ordinary use of the word idealist. It's probably already in your vocabulary, but here we find a special philosophical application of that word. Idealist here designating a particular philosophical or ontological position the position that everything is mental. So an idealist, everything is idea, is the idea. Never mind. And Berkeley also will say that the fact that everything clearly does seem to persist even when no one's watching it is a proof of the existence of God. I always kind of wondered, I mean, maybe it's just maybe it's just a proof of the existence of bugs. I mean, what has to do the perceiving? Is it okay if there's a bug in the room? Will that hold the room up as in its perception? Of course, that's not in Berkeley's spirit at all. He wants to say that that everything's being held up constantly by the mind of God. Now, again, that sounds like a very strange thing to say, but when we put it in the context of the rationalists, as I'll do in a second, he's not the only one to say it. So yes, as I say, that last bullet point, then let me just try and provide a little context, because once we get a little context, we see why it is that he's saying these things, and even what's smart about saying such things. So two things, this slide and then the next. The first thing, he is a marginal character. He's not totally an empiricist. He is very concerned with theology. He has his proof, as he takes it, for the existence of God thoroughly woven into the overall theory. And we find in the 1600s, the rationalists, Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, by the way, who thought that everything was God, but he's saying everything is God in much the same spirit and for much the same goals as Berkeley saying that everything is idea or everything is mind. Because the problem was for the rationalists of the 17th century that physical notions of causation were challenging notions, they thought, of divine causation. So then you've got everything could be material, everything could be divine, that is, everything could be God, like Spinoza says, or everything could be mental, like Berkeley says. So there we see, I think, also with Berkeley and Spinoza, they really both, I think, sort of bridge between the 17th and 18th century. And Berkeley, I think, in particular, I wouldn't say this for Spinoza, but Berkeley in particular has one foot in empiricism and I think one foot in the rationalist spirit. It's certainly in as much as he doesn't want to let go of divine causation as a primary form of causation. He also, along these lines, as Berkeley, the not totally empiricist, anticipates Kant. You might notice if you get a certain edition of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, that there's the A preface and the B preface, because he wrote the B preface because he was so upset when he read reviewers of his book saying, well, this is just this Berkeley guy. And Kant said, no, I'm not just this Berkeley guy. And he's not, but Berkeley anticipates quite a bit of what Kant is saying. You got to remember, it is from Kant that we get the transcendental idealism of German philosophy of the 19th century. Berkeley is an idealist in this sense, the metaphysical sense. And Berkeley does other things. Berkeley does perceptual psychology, as I say, has a book on vision. He had some important theories of vision that anticipated optics later on. So he did real work there. He, of course, is very interested in theology as well. And he also works on philosophy of science. So to get this sense of this kind of Kantian feel of Berkeley in his philosophy of science, he develops an instrumentalist theory of scientific validation, like the pragmatists like William James. That is, Berkeley's idea is that it is the fact that it is useful, that the set of beliefs is useful for doing things. That's why we believe it to be true, and not because it corresponds to the external world. Of course, he would say that because, again, he doesn't want to have this, and doesn't, according to his view, you don't have, on his view, this problem between the external world and your picture of the external world. In a way, that's the whole point, which is what I want to turn to now, because this slide we're looking at the moment is about his rationalism, but now we want to talk about something I think gets deeper, which is his empiricism. I'll approach that the way that Berkeley did, in the sense of looking at what he sort of thought of as a kind of fairly terrible mess that John Locke had gotten himself into. John Locke, an excellent, also very earnest philosopher, one of the empiricists, so we often think of him as a 18th century, but Locke is early. Locke is mostly working Locke is working in the 17th century and 1600s. And he has a representational theory. As you know, I mean, it's not just the rationalists and Cartesians. I mean, Hume's talking about impressions all the time. I'm not sure if Hume actually has a representational theory. I think Locke surely does, as we will see now. And he's also trying to do philosophy of science. The big thing that all these people, including Descartes and Spinoza and all the rest of them, are wrestling around with is how to get theology and also about how to get mathematics, which in Platonic fashion, some of these people equated with uh, um, theology and God, into this sort of modern picture. Locke sort of wanted to say, well, Locke's very good, and he wants to say, well, what are the properties like weight, mass, density, shape, excuse me, that all the material substance that's extended in space all has. Okay, and those will be that'll be sort of the topic of science, that stuff. A la Newton, right, very similar, and not coincidentally, this is completely where Locke's getting it from. So Locke then develops this system of three different kinds of properties. There are three different sort of levels of properties, which is what sort of struck Berkeley as kind of going too far. That is, there are the properties that the thing has in itself, by which, as I said, I meant those properties that look like generic properties of all physical objects, objects that are extended in space. Then there are the properties that the object has to cause the mental representations. Locke is smart about this. I mean, look, we might think, for example, of color perception. And so we're thinking about, you've got the light, and that's going to be, in this case, the secondary property is going to be the light that's being emitted by the object or reflected off the object. And then the third order properties, the tertiary properties, are going to be the properties like the color, the experience of seeing the colors, the blues and the reds. And these are properties, subjective properties of experience, of our experience. So this is a very sophisticated view indeed. Locke had, most of the people at this time had a corpuscular theory of light. They thought light was streams of little packets that were going into the eye and making impressions, because they weren't sure about action at a distance. So their theory of light tended to involve literally sort of something from outside pushing in on the body. But so also the thing here to note, where we're going with this is that according to Locke, then we're in the same situation as we find ourselves in with Descartes. That is, the fact is, there are the things, the extended substances that have their own properties in and of themselves, and then there are the properties of our experiences, of our mental representations, our impressions. The empiricists, these people like impressions, right? Because the corpuscular theory is a sense of something literally pushing on something else, like a block of wax. Locke and they all like to talk about the block of wax. So why do we call Berkeley then an empiricist? So Berkeley looks at this and he wants to cut this Gordian knot. And in particular, what he's thinking about is this problem about the inner versus the outer. So you've got the mental representation of the world, and then you've got the external physical world itself. And so the big question mark, the big skeptical question mark, is the question mark between your mental representation, your inner representation of the world, and the external world. And so what's the connection, and is there a connection? Do I even know anything about the external world at all? What's the relationship between the mental properties and the physical properties, if you will? Or are the even, right, well, we'll see what Berkeley's approach to that. He said, look, if you're an empiricist, this is what empiricist is about. What is an empiricist? An empiricist is someone who says that all knowledge is based on experience or produced by experience. Experience with the senses is the sense of it, the spirit of it. And so, well, if there's anything that is not something that is part of experience, then talking about that is incoherent. We cannot coherently refer to something that is not part of our experience. And that's where Berkeley and Hume coincide. which is what we'll look at next. So here's the way that Berkeley sort of cuts this Gordian knot of Locke's. He says, look, gang, he says, you're saying that you don't know whether the experience is like the external world, but if you're a good empiricist, then what you think is that what you have is experience, that all knowledge is based on experience, that what you know about is experience. And so the thing about both Berkeley and Locke that a lot of people miss is that they're not skeptics. They don't think there's a problem about the world beyond experience. They think it doesn't make any sense to talk about anything that's not part of experience. And Berkeley points out that that would be this external world that you're having all these problems with. You say that you don't know about the relationship between the mental and the physical, but what you experience is the mental. So why don't you just get rid of the physical, eliminate the physical? So you see there's also a kind of possibility space for dealing with the problem. And one of the things that's brilliant about Berkeley is he finds this other sort of square in the probability space that no one tried before. Everyone says, well, someone like me or most people in philosophy say, well, try and have everything be natural and nothing that's sort of dualistic. And that's mostly gonna, the intuition is you're gonna come down on sort of the natural world, all of which has all kinds of conceptual problems of its own, of course, but it's part of the fun. So Berkeley says, well, if you just say everything's mental, and this is another aspect of Berkeley and Hume, and I'll talk about this too when we talk about Hume more in depth. If everything's mental, then nothing's mental, right? If everything's physical, then nothing's physical. I mean, to say that something has certain properties, if that's going to do something linguistically, it's going to be that you're contrasting it with other things that don't have that property. But if there's a property that everything has, the property sort of goes poof. And that's really the way that you get out of the problem. It's a pseudo problem. Skepticism about the external world is a pseudo problem. And I think Berkeley and Hume they both give us versions of an argument that actually deals with the problem. We call this idea that contrast it with sort of essentialist ideas. You can think that you're looking at, Berkeley says, look, you say there's this external world, what is it? It's the set of all of your experiences. Literally, that is, what are you referring to when you say the external world? You are referring to this large set of all the experiences that you've had. Sometimes you're referring to particular experiences, like remember when it was so-and-so's birthday, but when you say there's an external world, there's a universe that I live in, what you're talking about are all these experiences that you've had. And so notice that experience then falls down on this view, interestingly, between the inner and the outer, the external and the internal. It's experience. We think of experience as sort of a psychological word, so that the connotation there kind of implies we're talking about something mental, but we want to understand experience in a more neutral way here. The empiricist says, look, what we have is experience. What is it? Well, it sort of is what it is. That is, I say that the coffee cup is here, and I say, and it's really real. Well, the empiricist is going to tell us that last "and it's really real" part is some gratuitous metaphysical statement that doesn't mean anything, because you can't mean anything more by saying that it's real than just simply that you're seeing it and holding it. There it is. I mean, that's what you mean when you say that there's a coffee cup. Is one, right? And so, for example, Hume says this. He says in the treatise where he discusses Berkeley and discusses this point on the second bullet point that I'm telling you now. And he says, look, you say, a question you would ask if you're thinking about Berkeley, right? Well, but what about the common world that we all have? And Hume's answer, he's very self-confident sometimes. He says, look, you say there's some common world, but I have my experiences, and I don't experience something that looks like a common experience. or a general experience. So I don't know what you're really talking about. I don't really think there is anything like that. Again, notice, he's not crazy, but he's saying when you say there's a world. So now, how do we unlock this? There are, pardon the pun, there are two worlds, right? There's the world of phenomenal experience, and that's the world that isn't common. And then maybe there's the world in the history books and the chemistry books, but that's not a central world of experience. That's something else. Um, but again, Hume takes empiricism out to probably, as I think Bertrand Russell says, this probably about to the last station. You probably can't get more empiricist than Hume. And Berkeley, he wants to prove the existence of God. But notice Berkeley's also saying things about physical objects as well. He's saying that physical objects are something that have the property of being mental or somehow caused by the mind. And this is also saying something about the objects of experience that goes beyond what we're warranted to say simply by virtue of the experiences themselves. So Berkeley and Hume aren't identical. Berkeley, you could say, I sort of thought like this for a while. You could say that Berkeley's kind of real clever, and he's just saying, okay, gang, let's just say that everything's mental, so that we can just forget about it. Just say everything's mental, and then it's over, which does work. I mean, that is the beauty of the argument. That is what interests me about the argument still. But I don't think Berkeley really, Hume would say something like that. He doesn't, but he might. He likes Berkeley fine that way. But Berkeley is serious about this level of being, which is the mental as well as God, and he wants to say more about it. Now, I guess then the last thing I would say about that, though, is that Hume, because Hume really just wanted everything to be based on experience, so Hume has this really sort of very, very simple psychology, just about constant conjunction, conditioning, and resemblance. It's very Lilliputian. It's very minimalistic, and that's one of the things that Kant notices when Kant has his big inspiration to say, well, we have to look at what's possible in order for experience to be possible, because that we know has to be true if experience is happening. So, and I think that Berkeley does get at that. So in that sense, Berkeley, I think it's just true that in one sense, Berkeley kind of moves past Hume on that. Okay. So anyway, so the goal just was to present to you Berkeley, the idealist. I think for many generations of us poor folks just sitting in classrooms trying to figure out what's going on, when Berkeley is presented outside of context and you don't understand why he's saying the things that he's saying, it certainly is a sort of weird thing to say. I mean, that's the thing about philosophical theories. He's not just sitting around somewhere and by himself having a beer in woods and going, oh, I know. No, he's working on these collective problems that this community has. And he's thinking about strategies, and he's part of this conversation. And I hope you took away, among other things, and how it is that he really is an empiricist. The empiricist, I think, has the empiricist read as the non-skeptic, as I read empiricism, I think has a plausible response to a skepticism that I think is rather satisfying. And I think that in that sense, Berkeley and Hume have the same argument that you can't, if you're speculating about something that's beyond experience, we don't have any reason to concede to you that you're speculating about anything at all. That's sort of the argument, and I think that's a good one. So anyway, that's Berkeley, the epistemological side of Berkeley. Lots to him. So I'll give you some links, and you can look. He writes about other things too. I'll give you some links to some of the other things he writes about. He writes about tar shale on the moon.